Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite, and I'll be hanging out with you today as we continue on in our series about populations. Now, I just realized the other day that my little intro clip has said ecology, even though we've been working on populations for the last 6 videos. My apologies. Anyway, our topic for the day is humans and disease. So let me get you some objectives and we'll get going. By the end of this video, here's what I need you to know. Compare and contrast risk factors for disease, define emergent disease, and describe several diseases that pose a significant threat to humans. So that's what we got for the day. Up until this point, we've been talking about populations. The last couple of videos have talked about human population. Today, and for the next 2 or 3 videos, we're going to talk about things that pose a risk to the health of humans within the human population. So let's go ahead and jump on in. First thing I want to talk about are 3 types of risk. You can take all risk posed to humans and break it down into 3 major categories. You've got physical risk, and that is stuff that can do us bodily harm. Think of things falling on us, cuts, scrapes, hurricanes, lightning strikes, all of those things that come from the outside world and damage our body in some way. Next category of risk is going to be disease, and that could be infectious disease or chronic disease. I'll talk about those in a moment. Or it could be chemical. This would be infection or exposure to some sort of radioactive substance or toxin or some other chemical that can do our bodies harm, and we'll talk about those in depth in later videos. So I'm just going to leave it at that. 3 types of risk to human health: physical, disease, and chemical. Now I want to go ahead and just jump on into talking about things that can cause, death. This is a breakdown of causes of death around the world, and I want to notate a couple things on here. If you look at our pie chart right here, the biggest cause of death worldwide is cardiovascular disease. Now, proportionally, that is probably mostly in the developed world, but around the world, most people die from cardiovascular disease, followed very closely by infectious disease. And you can take this infectious disease section and break it out, and you can see that most people who die from infectious disease die from some sort of respiratory infection, followed by HIV/AIDS, and then diarrheal diseases and tuberculosis. So these are kind of the major infectious diseases that end up causing people to die. And then if you look back at our main wheel over here, cancer is responsible for 13% of deaths worldwide. Respiratory and digestive diseases are 10%, and then you've got injuries, maternal and perinatal conditions, and then others. So if you take all the people in the world who die in a given year and break them up by cause of death, this is roughly what it's going to look like. Now, I want to talk a little bit about infectious disease, and then we're going to talk about acute and chronic diseases. Infectious diseases, basically, there's 3 types that do the most harm. You've got respiratory diseases. Respiratory diseases are going to be things like pneumonia and it just left me pneumonia and tuberculosis. Sorry about that. Of infectious diseases that end up killing the most people, tuberculosis and pneumonia are the biggest ones. You've got HIV/AIDS, which is obviously a sexually transmitted disease that currently infects like 33 million people. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. And then you've got the diarrheal diseases that lead to severe dehydration. Examples would be cholera, typhoid, I believe. Those diseases are generally waterborne and pass through unsafe drinking water. So if you talk about diseases that can pass from person to person, the major killers are respiratory diseases, AIDS, and diarrhea, but infectious disease recognizes any disease that can be transmitted from one human to another or from an animal to a human. And these are different from chronic diseases. Chronic diseases are diseases that are slow and steady killers. An example of a chronic disease would be like heart disease or a cancer. Chronic diseases are diseases that are not generally transmitted from one person to the other. They are usually something that goes wrong within a person's body, and then it leads to a slow death. And you can contrast that with an acute disease, which is a disease that comes along quickly and it usually causes its damage quickly and then is gone. An example of an acute disease would be Ebola hemorrhagic fever, which can kill you in as short of 2 weeks. Now, notice not all acute diseases kill you, but note that their onset is usually very quick. All right, I want to do a little compare and contrast. I've been doing compare and contrast, but here's another compare and contrast for you. We're going to compare and contrast the diseases of poverty versus the diseases of wealth. And Depending on your socioeconomic status, your risk for disease is going to be very different. So, if you live in poverty, some of your risk factors for disease are things like unsanitary conditions, poor nutrition, unsafe water, and most of disease and death in the developing world is going to be related to these conditions right here. In large part, especially for children, malnutrition is a problem because if you are malnourished, your body's not as strong. So any infection that comes along can easily take over your body and do you more harm than if you were properly nourished and had proper access to health care as if you were living in the developed world. So poverty, it's going to be a lot of communicable disease, a lot of infectious disease, a lot of waterborne illness, and a lot of illness related to unsanitary conditions and poor nutrition. Contrast that with diseases of wealth, where the risk factors are very different. In rich countries, some of the risk factors for death include access to alcohol and tobacco, sedentary life, malnutrition. Obviously, the big diseases in wealthy countries are going to be things like heart disease and cancers. Those are going to be the two big ones. So these are not so much going to be infectious disease. They're going to be diseases that are the result of lifestyle. They're called lifestyle diseases. All right, epidemic versus pandemic, and then we're going to talk about several diseases. The rest of this video is going to be about diseases that impact people worldwide, and you just need to recognize the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic. An epidemic is a disease that infects a large number of people in a small area. A pandemic is a disease that affects a lot of people across a broad area. So if you have got like an epidemic within your country, then it's going to be called an epidemic. I just use the definition in the definition. But an epidemic is usually going to affect like a city or a county or a country. Pandemic is when it starts spreading from country to country across borders. So know the difference between those two. And the rest of this video is going to be just ticking through a list of diseases that you should be aware of and know a little bit about. And the first one of these diseases is going to be bubonic plague. Bubonic plague you've heard of, like Black Death back in the 1300s. It does still occur today. Some things you need to know about it. It's transmitted by the pathogen Yersinia pestis, and it is fleas that carry it from person to person. Usually, they will bite a rodent, they'll get the plague from the rodent, and then they'll bite a person and transmit that disease. Bubonic plague leads to several things. There is a type of plague that infects the lungs and essentially causes them to break down, and the person's not able to breathe, and they end up dying. There's another type, the commonly known bubonic plague, that causes swellings under the arms and the neck and in the groin. And in both of those cases, death can come on fairly suddenly. It is a highly contagious disease, and like I said, while it was common back in the Middle Ages, it does still occur today. Next up on the list, you've got malaria, which is worldwide one of the biggest killers next to AIDS. It is caused by a pathogen called Plasmodium, or a group of pathogens called Plasmodium. Mosquitoes are the vector, which means they carry the disease from human to human to human to human. It is most common in tropical regions, so think Central Africa, Southeast Asia, Central America, South America, and usually what happens is somebody will become infected with malaria. That malaria gets into their red blood cells and starts multiplying such that it ruptures their red blood cells. Some of the symptoms include joint pain, flu-like symptoms, weakness, anemia. Malaria can be deadly. It does kill millions of people worldwide on a yearly basis. And because it is such a problem, DDT, which is a pesticide, is used frequently to eradicate the mosquitoes in an area, which obviously gets rid of the malaria, but some scientists or environmental scientists argue that there are environmental impacts of DDT that make it hazardous to use. So there is a debate that always goes around about malaria, about whether DDT should be used to take care of the mosquitoes that cause or transmit the malaria. Then you got tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is nasty stuff. It's a bacterial infection of the lungs, highly contagious. If a person with tuberculosis coughs or sneezes, those pathogens can hang out in the air for a couple hours. It breaks down lung tissue. People who have it usually end up dying from essentially drowning in their own fluids. It's very difficult to treat because it's a bacterial infection. People who go on the antibiotic regimen have to stay on that regimen for a year. If they stop taking their medicine early, the only bacteria that are left are the ones that are highly resistant to the antibiotic, which means that those antibiotic-resistant pathogens will multiply again, fill their body up, and now you are infected with an antibiotic-resistant strain of tuberculosis. So obviously that makes it very difficult to treat. Also, treatment is expensive. So if you are in the developed world and you get tuberculosis, you're probably going to be okay. If you're in the developing world, things may not go so well for you. I need to talk quickly about emergent diseases, and then we're going to wrap up with a couple of those. So an emergent disease is either a disease that is new, just been described, or it has not been common in the last 20 years. And the diseases I'm going to go through here in the next couple of seconds are all emergent diseases. So first up on the list is HIV/AIDS. It is an STD. It is also transmitted through intravenous drug use. Origins. Let me just dispel this for people who see this video. HIV/AIDS did not come from someone having sex with a chimpanzee. Its origin is in chimpanzees, but the most likely scenario is a hunter killed a chimp. While butchering that chimp, the virus was transmitted from the chimp to the hunter, and then the hunter passed it on from person to person sexually. So it probably came from eating infected chimp meat. Globally, 33 million people are infected with AIDS presently. Places in the world that are most infected are areas of sub-Saharan Africa, where some places the adult population might be up to 25% HIV positive. There are drugs to keep the viral load very low within a person, effectively not curing them, but at least allowing them to live a long and healthy life. Those are called retroviral drugs, but they are expensive and not readily available. So there's another disease that if you get it in the developed world, well, your life probably isn't going to be the best. You can survive and have a fairly decent life. If you are in the developing world, then things aren't going to be so good. Two to finish up, you have got Ebola. Ebola is crazy virus. First identified in near the Ebola River in Africa. It is a virus. It leads to extensive internal bleeding, and it has a very high mortality rate. It kills between 50 and 80% of the people who become infected with it, and currently there is no treatment. I'm just going to go ahead and leave that one at that. I'm pretty sure that mad cow is our last one. No, actually there's one other beyond it. Mad cow is caused by a pathogen called a prion. Prions are pretty poorly understood. Scientists do know that they are a type of protein that mutates within the body, so they go from being like a beneficial protein to a harmful pathogen. Mad cow disease leads to neurological deterioration, which leads to the name mad cow. It was first identified in cows, but it can be transmitted cow to cow or cow to human. Humans eating meat from an infected cow can get the disease. Unfortunately, properly cooking the meat generally will not kill off the prion. So when mad cow is identified, usually the cows are quarantined, and a lot of times they are put down because there's not a good way to deal with that pathogen. And wrapping us up with the avian flu. Avian flu worldwide has killed about 400 people. So if you stack it up against the other ones, it's not that big a deal. But people worry about it because it has the potential to become a global pandemic. It is transmitted from birds to humans, and humans have got no immune defense to it. We've got immune defense to normal strains of the flu, but avian flu is not one that our immune systems can deal with. Currently, transmission from birds to humans is a fairly difficult thing, but people worry that there may be a mutation in that virus, in which case it could easily be passed from birds to humans, and then from there it could become a global pandemic. When you look for pandemic response plans online, most of them relate to the flu and generally avian flu. So that kind of gives an indicator that this is one that at the moment has not done much damage, but people worry about becoming a major problem. And with that, we have walked through all of the things that can potentially harm or kill a human. Not all of them, but the major ones. So make sure that you are aware of the diseases, acute versus chronic, diseases of poverty versus diseases of wealth, and the diseases I just talked through. Thanks for joining us on the Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite, and we'll see you again.